My name is Hi everybody. My name is Rick Hanton, and I'm the head robot design judge for Arizona. And I'm going to do this presentation today on all the different ways that you can do small things essentially to impress your judges during the season. So hopefully this will be helpful for both people that are on teams, coaches, anybody who's trying to do well in either this or any other FLL season. They're pretty generic. So my background, I'm a software engineering manager for a company in Tempe called Cupra. And I first learned about FIRST. I didn't really know about it when I was in school, but I first learned about FIRST when I was applying to colleges. And so when I got to college in Iowa, where I wound up going to college, my college happened to be the university in town that ran all the FIRST events for the state of Iowa. And so I got involved my first year as a volunteer. And then after that, I got involved essentially planning events in Iowa for a number of years. And so I worked on a whole bunch of first stuff in Iowa. I planned events, I refereed, I think I might have judged too. And then I moved to Nebraska for work and kind of also met my wife while doing FLL in Nebraska. And so I did a bunch of both judging and refereeing in Nebraska for a number of years. And then I moved to Arizona. And I don't think I've done any refereeing here for FLL, but I do a lot of judging. So, and my wife, so background, my wife is also for a number of years, has been the head project judge in Iowa, or sorry, in Arizona. So, so anyways, the two of us are at a lot of events. Either you'll probably see one of us or Nancy or one of the other head judge folks at most of the events in Arizona. This year is a little different, but once we get back to normal, that's how it'll be. I studied aerospace engineering, and then I switched over to computer engineering, and I just finished up a master's of engineering in cybersecurity, and enjoy lots of different things, including video stuff, video games, model rockets, all kinds of cool things back from the aerospace days. So down to what we're talking about today. So first off, I kind of wanted to give an overview of how team judging works in case somebody hasn't been through the process or haven't had a team before, or been on a team before. I'm going to give kind of a rundown of how that process works. And specifically, this will also be interesting in how it's going to work this year, which is different than previous years. So stay tuned. So first off, the judging sessions are mainly for the team to explain their work. What did you do? Why did you do it? How did you do it? Why is this awesome to the judges? With that in mind, different states do it slightly differently, but generally we don't allow coaches into the sessions because we want to talk to the team, to the students themselves, and see what they have to say about their robot, their presentation, their core values, all those things. And just forewarning, especially if your team is like super excited about one of those particular things, judging sessions are really short, right? I mean, relatively so. That they might have a ton of things to say, but the judges only have a very, very limited time with each team to work with them in, and so keep that in mind as you're preparing for judging. So this year, so I'm going to kind of run this down. This year, what to expect. If you look at the right side of this chart, we've broken it down where, so usually, or in the past, this might continue after this year actually, but in the past, usually you have separate judging sessions for your project and for your robot design and for core values. This year, partially because of COVID, also because I think partially because this is how some of the older first groups do this, we're kind of combining it all into one. And so probably what will happen is you'll have different judges who care about multiple things, but you're talking to kind of all of them at once, or at least in sequence. And so if you look at that chart, essentially we get a couple minutes to say hello, and then kick off the project the team can kind of kick right into the project presentation for 5 minutes. Once you go over 5 minutes, the judges are probably going to want to cut you off and say, hey, I got some questions that I need you to answer. So there's 5 minutes of questions per project. And then once that's finished, you kind of might get cut off again because the robot design judges need their time to, one for you get 5 minutes if you want to kind of explain your robot. If you don't, we're happy to like ask questions and try and figure out how you designed your robot based on your answers. And then there's a few minutes. Essentially, the idea is that this is kind of cool. The core value judges will be watching that entire time to essentially understand how your team works together with each other. And then they'll have a few minutes for talking to your team, particularly about core values, things that you did during the year, and how your team interacts and things like that for 3 minutes at the end. And then something that's also new and kind of cool for in case teams don't sit down after each event and talk about feedback, there'll be 5 minutes at the very end where judges can kind of directly give you a little bit of feedback before you head out. So and altogether that's a decent amount of time. There's what is that? It's about 30 minutes for all those judging sessions. So it's I think it'll be a challenge for teams sometimes to kind of keep focus for that long, but we'll do our best and kind of try and ask everybody questions and keep everybody engaged. So let's see if I didn't cover any of this. So again, the judges are going to remind you when your time's up. So be sure to thank them for their time as well. That's something good to think about. So if you have any questions about this, you can ask that at the end too. It's a new thing, so I'm happy to take questions about it, even though I might not have every answer. So I've been judging FL for maybe not 12 years. I've been working on FL for 12 years, but I've been judging for probably about 10 years. And so I have a few, I broke this kind of everything down into a few main tips for how, things you can do to impress the judges, whichever judges those may be, with whatever you're doing for FLL. So here's what I've got. The main things are documenting your work, reading and understand all the rules or all the main things you're trying to do with each different presentation. Kind of along the same lines, reading the rubrics because they're available. You can very easily know what the judges are looking for with each presentation, so that makes life easy. And then the last thing, of course, is practicing. Obviously, things are easier if you've done them a number of times before, so practicing helps a lot. You'll see the best teams probably have practiced with the coach, probably have practiced with their parents. And so once they get to the judges, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's easy. So running those down, the first thing, documenting your work. So this is like, the reason that this is my tip number one is that for whatever judging you're doing, this is probably the biggest, this is always the thing when we get to the state competition that separates the teams that are okay from the teams that are, considered good or really good, right, is documentation. And my biggest thing is it's really not hard, right? So if you look at the rubrics, which is, I'll get to that more in a second, if you get to a lot of the accomplished or exceeds marks on the rubrics, they'll particularly say something about documentation. Did the judges see documentation? And it doesn't have to be amazing. Amazing's great, but it can be something that's just some notes that you were taking as you were trying to figure things out. What were your original ideas for your project? What were your original ideas for your robot? How does this year's robot, is you're going to change it from last year's robot? Things like that. Super simple. It can be on notebook paper. You don't have to like copy it down and make it look all pretty or anything crazy. You can. That'll probably help us, but I mean, whatever you have, that's great. I think this year the way this is going to work for a lot of the documentation is you'll like upload those to the judges beforehand, which also will probably prevent you from doing it like the night before or anything. So just make, the best thing is to, that's kind of my third point here, is like, it's a little bit more work to put that documentation together, but you might already have it. You might have already done something. If you're scanning pieces of notebook paper to me, that's totally okay. If you're taking if you're not like drawing detailed engineering diagrams, you're just taking some pictures of your robot as you're changing and building your robot, that's great. Like that's essentially showing the judges you started at some point that was totally different from where you ended, and here, like what you're trying to show is here's how you got there. So that's why documentation is great. The other thing, kind of same thing. Make sure you read the rubrics so you know what types of documentation that judges might particularly be looking for. And so, and the other thing too is like when you're reading the rubrics and you're looking at which things say documentation, you know, doing that documentation, documenting some things will probably help you, you know, structure and plan out your project or your robot even better. So that's tip number one, documenting your work. Tip number two is reading the rules, right? It's like it's always funny. You know, how many, you know, there's always at least a few teams, even at the final state finals competition, that we, you know, they come into robot judging and we're like, did you actually read the, you know, the rules for the robot game? Like, why do you have an extra motor or something like that that you shouldn't have? Things like that. And we're not, you know, we don't really care because we're just here to understand your robot. But, you know, that's something that when you get onto the playing field, they will enforce. So, you know, just read the rules. They change every year. The robot game changes every year. The project prompt changes every year. You know, the same thing my wife says that too. Sometimes it's like they go in and they do judging of a project and the judges are talking to each other and they're like, yeah, you know, that's a, you know, they did an awesome project, but it really doesn't answer the project prompt for this year. And so I think that's another huge thing is like read the project prompt. Like if you're, you know, I get people that have cool, awesome ideas and, you know, start deviating off to the side of the project prompt. But like once you do that, you need to catch yourself and be like, wait, is this actually answering, you know, what we were asked to come up with an idea for, right? So that's a huge thing too. You know, we don't we don't want to score you down because you didn't, you know, read what you're supposed to read. So, you know, just take a look at all the rules. Take a look. Same with the robot game, particularly. You know, people come up with awesome questions all the time. You know, that's I guess as an engineer, that's one of the things that I'm doing every day. It's like, what are the, you know, I talk to my designers and I'm like, you know, what are the edge cases of this? You know, you built this awesome design, but if, you know, these weird things happen, or in the context of the robot game, you know, if I come up with some crazy idea of like how to accomplish one of the missions that, you know, seems like it might be borderline on breaking the rules, like, you know, go ask that as a question and be like, can I do that? Because chances are somebody else somewhere in the world is going to have that same question if it's not already answered in the Q and A's. So read all those, read the Q and A's, read the rules, make sure you're up on everything and you know what you're trying to do. Yeah, and I put some stuff here at the bottom too. It's like there's certain parts that are restricted, that changes from year to year. There's certain touches that are restricted, that tends to change from year to year. The other thing too is like for, you know, particularly for the robot design judging, if you understand all the missions that you're attempting, that's a huge thing, right? We judge on that. Like, do you know what missions you're doing and why you're doing them? Usually there's also, I forget if it's on this here or not, but usually there's also a question of like, you know, the best teams come to us and essentially show us that they understand, you know, all the things that they need to do to accomplish every single mission on the board. Now, do they have a plan to accomplish everyone? No, maybe not. But at least they show us that they looked at each one and they said, okay, well, this one's going to be really easy. I'm going to do it. You know, this one's really hard. It's on the far side of the board. You know, let's not do that one. But showing us that understanding is really what gets you to the next level. So that's a big thing. Okay, reading the rules. Next, same kind of line of thought is reading the judging rubrics. So if you've done FLL before, you always see judges writing lots of notes, you know, just madly writing because like we have no time to both listen to teams, ask questions, write notes before the next team comes in and, you know, we have to do it all over again. You know, sometimes for like robot judging, if you know, when you're bringing your robot, we're like taking pictures of the robot so we don't forget the robot after we've seen 16 other robots. So, you know, that's a big thing for us. So you can help us out a ton if you read the rubrics and you know, now that there's kind of a presentation period for robot, you can kind of front run us and like try and give us all the information on the rubric before we have to ask questions to try and gather that info. So, you know, please read the rubrics. Same goes for project and core values. Then you'll know what we're looking for, and you can kind of help us get that without having to prod you for questions. Or potentially the big problem is like, we'll try to ask questions so we can get to the bottom of that stuff. But if you don't, you know, if you don't explain or you don't demonstrate those things to us, we might miss asking that question, and then we're just kind of stuck. We're not going to rate you the highest because we don't know, right? So read the rubrics. It's a big thing. They're all available online. You can just go on firstinspires.org and download them. I guess looking at this year's rubrics, which changed a bit, what I would say is focus on the categories for each rubric and the description. That's going to be a big thing of what we're looking at. And then you can kind of go in the individual boxes and see like what the levels of what we're looking for is. There's a little documentation in there, and I'll show you an example in a sec. And once you understand those categories, look at the high categories. What is accomplished saying you want to do, and shoot for something like that. It's kind of interesting this year if you look at those rubrics, because they change them around. So, you can see this one for project. There's, if you look at just the first thing, they're trying to identify a problem, right? And so we're going to focus a lot on like, what's that category? What are they trying to do? And then, what you want to do is kind of like see where they're going, right? So, obviously is the problem well-defined? Accomplished is, it's a clear definition of the problem. They understand their problem, right? Same thing with down below it. Did they do research? Well, accomplished is a wide variety of research. Now it's interesting, this year they actually changed it so that instead, they used to give us a definition of what exceeds kind of meant. But this year it's basically, if you've done as much or more than accomplished, there's a spot for us to essentially write down why we think that, right? Which is great for judges, I guess, because that helps us to really explain like why the best teams are being rated, more than accomplished are rated the best. But yeah, shoot for accomplished, and go bigger and broader and do cooler things if you can, and then we'll write down something awesome and exceeds. So this is kind of how it works. I think all of them are structured the same way. They've been like this for years. So there's usually 5 different categories, and then a few different items under each category as to what we're rating the team on. So, for each thing, there's only, 10 different items you have to really look at. And, if you want to with your team, you can always just, have your coach or have the parent or something, go, watch your presentation, or watch your robot design presentation, or what you're going to say the robot design judges, and go through and mark off like, what did they think? Do they think you're showing that you did research? Do they think that you're showing that you've got a really engaging presentation? If they don't, then that'll tell you a whole bunch. And so that kind of gets to my last thing, which is practice, right? Practicing is always the most fun thing. You just want to play with the robot. You want to build cool things. You want to, solve more missions, right? But particularly because the judging session is one big session this year, and it's long. It's a lot of time. You have to like pay attention, present a bunch of things, answer a lot of questions. Hopefully your mind isn't too numb at the end of it, but you need to. It's good to practice that, because it is so long that if you've done it a couple times, you'll just be like, oh, this is a piece of cake. This is something I've done a whole bunch, and I understand how to do it, and I have an idea from my coach of like questions they might ask and how to answer those. So it's not a big deal, and you'll look like super well put together for the judges, which is great. You want to essentially I kind of put together steps here. It's like, first you want to like plan everything out. Like, what are you doing? Who's talking when? We see, some teams just, there's one person who speaks a bunch, and we have to ask questions to really like get information out of the other team members. Other teams have like a super structured presentation for robot and project, where, they know exactly when somebody's talking and who the next person is, and, what each person's talking about, and it flows really well. So, plan it out, figure out who's talking when, if somebody's a little quiet, who needs to like prompt them to speak up and talk about some piece of your project or your robot. Step 2 is, get some people to stand in as your judges, right? That's easy. You got parents, you got probably you might have older siblings, you might have, friends or family or something who could judge. I'll get down to it in a sec to, they don't have to be right there with you, right? They can judge from wherever nowadays, right? So find some people to judge. they can help you out, give them the rubric so they can jot down what they think about it. And then you can they can tell you all about what they thought as feedback at the end, right? And then, again, it's like if you're actually having people watch you, try and, have somebody time it, right? Structure it like it's going to be an actual judging session for one of the competitions. So, look at that list of all the segments. It's basically 5 minutes presentation, 5 minutes Q&A for everything, and have somebody time you and hold you to it, right? It's like if you spend 7 minutes on your presentation, they should just cut you off at 5 minutes and let the judges see what they think of that, right? That's what would probably happen in reality. So do it like it's real. And then step 4 is do it, do the whole thing, 30 minutes, do it over Zoom, because that's kind of how you're going to do it with the actual judges, right? And there's sometimes it's painful to do stuff over Zoom or Google Hangouts or whatever the case is, because that just makes it harder to talk to people. Make sure maybe you need like a good like headset or something to like talk to people on. Whatever you need to kind of like you'll figure out your problems early, so that then when you get in the actual judging session and we're strapped for time, we don't have to like wait while you sort out your issues with your computer, or your laptop, or your phone, or whatever you're doing to present to us. So those are my big things. There's a lot of other stuff you can do to improve your team's performance this year, I guess, which is what this is all about. There's tons and tons of resources on the internet. We don't think, as a robot judge, like we don't think it's bad if you go on YouTube and watch tons of videos of really cool past or present Lego robots and come up, use that as a source of good ideas of like something cool you could build, right? I mean, most of the time they're not giving you plans. They're not, saying, here's, step by step how to build this claw thing that we built to do it. So it's like, you'll see something cool and have to come up with like, okay, how do I build that? How do I make that work for this year's competition? Things like that. So go check that out. There's Reddit forums, there's FL forums on their website, lots of different places to get good information. The other thing too is there's, First Legally, it's cool because First Legally was, I guess it wasn't new when I started working on it, but it was younger. And now it's been around for so long that there's actually some really cool books about that parents or coaches have written about, here's how to build, really interesting designs that are useful for most competitions with the EV3. Or here's like, a whole book of tips on how to do Lego League well with, competitions, or how you're designing or, strategizing for the competition rounds. So there's tons of stuff out there. It's really cool. I bought a book last year just because it's, it's interesting to me. It's like I don't have an AV3, but I'm always interested to like see all these cool ideas. Same thing for presentations, right? You can go on YouTube, you can probably find some presentations from Lego League of cool project ideas. Probably the coolest thing that I find in First Lego League a lot of the time, back from when I started. So when I started at working on Lego League at Iowa State, the woman that I worked for, Camille, was she was essentially the judge advisor for the international FLL competition for quite a number of years. And it's always interesting to like see kind of like hear about the top level of performance from Lego League teams all over the world. Because, it's amazing how many teams, come up with a really cool idea for a project. And then you see teams, not every team, obviously, but you see, maybe a few teams per year across the United States, come up with such a cool, unique, good idea that it's like they'll actually go and try and like patent that and try and like build that idea. So, I mean, I've seen some really cool stuff. Like when I lived in Nebraska, there was a really cool project idea where they were from some small town, and the small town had this, van, I think, that would essentially help older people get from, their homes to the grocery store or wherever they're trying to go and things like that. But it was, it was a van designed for a small town with dirt roads. And so it was a few steps up to get into the van. So what one team actually designed was a a walker that people could use when they're going out, in this local van. And the walker, you could essentially walk it up to the van and then flip down a step that would give you an extra step up into the van. So it was like, people always come up with this really cool project ideas. So if you do that, go patent it, take it to the next level. It's super cool. And again, same thing. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Feel free to use others' ideas as a starting point, right? I mean, we see teams every year now, because there's lots of FL teams that have been around a long time, that we ask them, how did you come up with this design? And they're like, oh yeah, well, the kids 2 years ago or 3 years ago built this design, and it seemed to work really well, whatever. And that's not the end of the world, but I think definitely some robot judges will be like, well, it's like you didn't really start from scratch, right? You didn't design something having nothing to begin with, like some teams do. So that they might not like that as much. But I mean, on the other hand, if you can explain to us why these kids 2 years ago had this awesome design, and if you can explain to us why that design is still awesome for the challenges of this year, that's a big thing. Like we can understand that. That's something we can actually work with. Whereas if you're just saying like, well, a lot of times teams come in and they're like, well, this design was super awesome last year, and then you kind of see how they're actually trying to use it with the challenges of this year, and you realize it doesn't work very well. I mean, it's a cool robot, but if the robot doesn't help you do what you're trying to do, then it's not as cool a robot, right? So if, use that stuff as a starting point. Do understand what people have done and do even better, right? That's what we're always trying to do. So I think that's my last slide. So there's a couple people here. Do you have any questions about judging, or I guess I'll try to answer what I can. I'm not super familiar with all the judging sessions, but I've done it for a long time. So any questions? Just make sure you unmute yourself, if you're allowed to, I guess. So, hold on. Oh, okay. Just trying to bring up the chat. Oh yeah. So yeah, and we will share the slideshow later. Actually, I think Zachary has a slideshow as well, so we could share both the slides, and we'll have video later. So Berlin was asking that question. Anything else? Looking at the chat now too. So if you have something, you can chat as well. Okay. Yeah, no problem. As always, I mean, if you have any questions, feel free to, like I said, you can always ask them to FLL. I forget how you do that exactly, but you can send them in if you have a question about the robot game. If you have questions about judging or anything else in Arizona, feel free to throw those to Laura. And if it's about specific judging or anything like that, she'll hand it down to us, and we'll get you an answer back. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you guys for your time.